So in the previous video, we were talking about things that you can touch or weigh, and things that you can't touch or weigh. Now in science, we actually have a term for the things that you can touch, and we call these things matter. Anything that you can touch or weigh, no matter how tiny it is or how big it is, we consider it matter. Okay? Now chemistry is the study of matter and how it changes. So we have a kind of a better definition of what matter is rather than just saying, oh, it's something you can touch. Instead, what we say is that matter is something that has mass and occupies space. Another way to say occupies space is to say that it has volume. So please write this down so that you remember that if something occupies space, that means it has volume. And for the sake of this class, we're going to say if something has mass, it has weight. Something that you can weigh. And we talked about that before when we said, things that you can touch or weigh. We would consider something that you can weigh, we'll just say that that's its mass. Okay? Now, they define mass down here as the amount of matter in an object. And I know that sounds confusing, but for the sake of this class, you don't have to worry too much about this definition. Just think of mass as something that you can weigh, and something that occupies volume, occupies space. We call that volume. Okay. Now down here we have what we would consider this non-matter. Okay, these are things that do not have mass and do not have volume. They do not occupy space. Okay. So, of course, in science, we need to be able to measure things. Without measurements, there's no way we can practice good science. So, how do we measure mass? How do we measure volume? In other words, how do we measure matter? Okay? Mass is typically measured with a scale. Okay? So that's how we measure mass. And I got an example of a scale right there. We're going to use some of these scales in class. The units we're going to use to measure mass, is typically in science we prefer to use grams. Now it can be kilograms, milligrams, decagrams. As long as it's grams, we're okay. What about volume? Volume can be measured with, typically we're going to use a graduated cylinder or a beaker. Beaker is right here, and right here is your graduated cylinder. Okay, we can also use one of these, another type of beaker. So this is how we measure volume, or how much space something occupies. Now typically we use these with liquids, but we can actually get pretty clever and use it with solids too. And we'll go over those examples in class. Okay. Now, if you're the mathematic type and you remember talking about volume in math class, you can actually use equations to figure out volume of objects as well. So let's take this cube for example. Now this cube, we can actually get the volume of it following a simple formula. Maybe you guys remember this. L times W times H. Well, what do they stand for? L stands for length, W for width, and H for height. Correct? So you can actually get the volume of an object using equations also. You don't necessarily have to use these tools. So if I give you a box, it's a perfect box, you can measure the length, get the width and the height, and you're going to be able to get the volume of that box. Okay. Now, what are the units that we typically work with in volume? Now, those units are going to be liters. They could be milliliters, kiloliters, or just liters. Sometimes they're referred to as cubic centimeters as well. And just in case you wanted to know, we might do some conversions later, but if we ever do the conversions later, just pretty much 1 cubic centimeter equals 1 milliliter. Okay, but we might not get too much into that anytime soon, but we might talk about it later. So once again, we've identified what matter is, something that has mass and volume, occupies space. Identified that there's objects that don't have matter, don't occupy space, or have weight to them, have mass to them. And we talked about how do we measure matter? How do we measure mass and volume? Mass is measured with the scale, and those units are in grams. Volume is measured with these tools right here. We can also use mathematical equations. And here are the units for volume.